Good morning. Thank you for joining today's webinar, which is on manual handling awareness. I'm Russell Corlett, and I'm joined by my colleague Andrew Rivett. What we'll do today is we'll cover some definitions of manual handling, what types of injuries can come from manual handling. Andrew will talk about the mechanics of movement. I'll touch on the law across Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and also Republic of Ireland. We will cover assessing risk and what good practices are for manual handling. So, if we're trying to define manual handling, what is it? As it says on the screen, any transporting or supporting of a load, including the lifting, putting down, pushing, pulling, carrying, or moving thereof by hand or bodily force. So, it's something that everyone does on a day-to-day basis, whether it's lifting a briefcase or a load in a warehouse, or perhaps pushing and pulling a trolley. All sorts of activities fall under the category of manual handling. A few pictures just to give some ideas. You've got the lifting, putting down, pushing, pulling, carrying, moving, as we said earlier. So all of those things, and there's some pictures there just to sort of reiterate day-to-day activities you would see: lifting a box, pulling a trolley, someone in a shopping mall, something like that. So something we come across on a daily basis. This slide looks and considers types of injuries that we get. Now, these are RIDDOR from 2012-13. We should probably update this and put the 14-15 figures on, but they will be very similar. And what this looks at is the number of people injured in Great Britain. So this is Health and Safety Executive data. And basically, over 90% of the 17,000 odd handling injuries were over 7-day injuries, and I think that's quite significant because that impacts on, particularly for smaller organisations, that impacts significantly if you lose somebody for over 7 days as a result of poor manual handling techniques causing injury. So the other, I think, thing that most people will relate to on the bottom of the slide, around 80% of adults are estimated to have experienced back injury at some point in their lifetime, and oftentimes that is through poor handling. And of course, this will affect you whether it's at work or at home. So it's an area that does need some consideration. So, looking at some of the sort of regular causes of back pain, you've got force, repetition, and posture to cover. So, force, exerting too much force on your back sounds fairly obvious, but something like lifting a box or an object that's far too heavy for you is excessive force, and that can cause the various types of injury on the back, which we'll cover in detail later. If you're doing something on a regular basis, day in, day out, that again can have a big impact. Wear and tear and fatigue. And of course, we all would recognise poor posture can make things worse as well. So I'll pass you on to Andrew just to talk a little bit about the makeup of the back, the spine, and we'll also move on to some handling techniques later as well.
Good morning. Without being too medical or too medically minded, some pictures there to actually demonstrate how the back is structured and how the back works. With some of the things, generally speaking, the back is the main focal point with the risk area of the body when we lift or lower or push or move. I think it's quite important not to forget on one of Russell's previous slides that there was some mechanical aid given, but that still needed body momentum. So there's still a manual handling activity taking place, which generally results in a poor ergonomic structure to actually get the thing into momentum. Damage, generally speaking on this, damage often happens to lower vertebrae, usually a vertebrae down at 5, lumbar area 5 or 4, or the disc in itself. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, of the slide, there's an example of a herniated disc, and the herniated disc is impinging on the spinal nerve. So if you look at the darker blue, That is obviously the spinal nerve from the picture on the left-hand side, and the herniated is the protruding sort of area. What used to be referred to in my day as a slip disc is now generally referred to either as a herniated disc or a prolapse disc. It's important to remember that sometimes this can result from a one-off activity, and the results are often debilitating for the individual who's been exposed to the particular risk. So the spine then, just to see how the spine is structured, on the left-hand side of the slide, we've got a picture of the four areas of the back, from running from the bottom or the lower area of spine, the sacral curve, to the lumbar, which is where we mentioned L4, L5 being particular areas at risk, so vertebrae at risk, the thoracic curve, and the cervical curve towards the neck and what's actually supporting the skull. So the picture on the right generally says this is where our spine is, to the top right of the photograph, which is where the spinal cord runs. Obviously there's vertebrae there, protecting areas of the spinal cord. And for those of you who have done a little bit of manual handling in the past, obviously flexion is quite important when we look at how the structure of the spine works. It's predominantly built of bone. Bone is quite brittle. Bone in this particular instance isn't there as a supporting load. Generally speaking, we do lift with the strongest part of our body, which is our leg, the thigh muscle representing that strong link. So the mechanics of moving then, what we're going to look at with regards to instability versus stability is when striking a stance when lifting things. If we look at, generally speaking, it's feet which are shoulders width apart and one slightly in front of the other. This gives us the ability to rock, especially with a little bit of flexion in the knee, and that gives the ability to absorb anything which could be an impact which results in a particular injury. And force, generally speaking, what we do with this is we generally get people to work in pairs and just push against each other using this stance to see who has got the stability applying the rules of force.
And as it shows in the picture there, by doing that sort of exercise, it indicates the load that you can place on the body, but also from a stance perspective, getting one foot in front of the other, legs slightly apart, as Andrew said, demonstrates a much more stable platform.
And then levers. Generally speaking, we do this just to look at leverage and where rules of force apply to particular areas of the arm in this one, pushing against each other. What generally takes the force of the impact? Is it the elbow or is it the shoulder? And the outcome, generally speaking, is that the movement is weaker than before the effort is put across to the shoulder, arms, trunk and legs. So even the hip and lower spine can take a little bit of an impact from this leverage.
So we will cover that in a little bit more practical detail in a few minutes. But if we just look at the legal position when it comes to manual handling, within Great Britain there's the Manual Handling Operations Regulations. Within Northern Ireland it's very similar, except it's the Manual Handling Operations Regulations Northern Ireland, and in the Republic of Ireland, Safety, Health and Welfare at Work General Applications Regulations covers manual handling. Just to say that within Ireland, then for proper manual handling training, the person doing the instruction should be FETAC Level 6 qualified. And I think just very simply, and we'll cover again a bit more detail, general duties under these regulations is, as with most risk assessment, try and avoid the need to put people in the position where they're exposed to the risk. So avoid the need for employees to undertake manual handling, and that might be through the use of sort of mechanical aids, etc., and to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of risk. So again, where the risk is significant, significant risk of injury, we would be expecting a specific manual handling risk assessment. So that's the law in no more detail than that, but just to give you an indication there is criminal legislation that governs manual handling. Now, we often use this, I'm going to use the word acronym, yes, that's right, TILE. There's other versions of it, but in essence, TILE is a good one to think about when it comes to manual handling. The task itself, you've got to look at the individual's capability, and there isn't a set limit on what you can lift. It will vary from one individual to the other. You know, if I exaggerate the point, somebody that is an extremely strong bodybuilder might be able to do manual handling of a greater load than somebody that's, you know, a sort of 6-stone weakling, let's say. So from that point of view, the individual's capability gets taken into account. The load itself, what size is it, what shape is it, you know, is it to be pushed or pulled, etc., gets factored in, and also the environment that you're working in. So are there stairs, are there slopes, is it wet, is it windy, is it indoors, outdoors, is it light, is it dark? So all those factors get taken into account when you're doing an assessment of risk for manual handling activities.
I think it's pertinent as well to mention at this point, when looking at individual capabilities, always consider anybody who's had a previous back injury. So if somebody has reported through the HR department that they've sustained an injury in the past, and it is a particular hazardous environment that they're being exposed to, consider avoidance. Again, the similar principle applies with a woman who presents herself as pregnant. Again, we're looking after both the pregnant individual and the unborn individual at this particular time.
Okay, now, again, things to think about when it comes to manual handling activities. I should mention you will get copies of these slides within the next week or two, as well as a certificate of attendance. So things to consider when it comes to manual handling. If we start at the top one, do we actually have to move the load in the first place? So why are we moving this load? Consider that. How best to carry out the task? You know, do we need 2 people? Do we need a piece of kit to move the equipment around? Who needs to be involved? What equipment or aids are needed, as I've just mentioned? What's the traffic route that you're taking? So where's this load going? Is it clear? Is it upstairs? Is it downstairs? Can we use a lift, for example? How quickly does the task need to be carried out, and how often? So depending how often the task, if it's a one-off, it might be appropriate to do a manual handling activity. If it's a regular occurrence, is there an easier way to do it so that we can actually avoid manual handling in the first place? So a practical example from my past, it was 3 people working daily lifting boxes, but it was coming off of a production line, and it just made sense to me to have one of these sort of spring-loaded, it's like a pallet holder, and it's spring-loaded, and it would rise so that the load was always kept at the right level. And the net result of doing that actually meant that we only needed 2 people working on that. So whilst the piece of equipment cost a bit of money, it was covered by the fact that we only needed 2 instead of 3 people doing the manual handling. So that was a relatively easy one to solve, but it's that kind of thing that you'd factor in when it comes to doing a manual handling risk assessment. I said we would go into some more practical stuff again, so I'll pass you over to Andrew to look at some good practices.
So the importance of the starting position is been emphasised throughout the previous slides. If we get ourselves in a position where we have got feet at shoulders width apart, we've got one slightly in front of the other, that will give us stability and stop the rocking movement from front to back and from left to right, side to side, and also keep the load, what we're lifting, close in relation to this. The idea or the optimum aim is to lift the load through the core rather than apply the rule of force or increase the rule of force and lift it further away from the trunk. The further away we lift it, the more multiples we give to the weight. So effectively, a good position would be head over hips, over knees, and that would ensure that we've got a stable lift coming through our core of our body. stand up without any sudden sort of jerky movement. So the idea would be to rise in one movement, rather than, I think, anybody who's seen any sort of weightlifting operations in the Olympic Games, you're looking at things like there's something called a snatch, which is often jerky, but it's got fluidity to it because it's one movement to get the weight above the head. And then there's a clean and jerk, which is two basically snatchy movements or jerky movements. So try and keep it as smooth as possible.
I'm sure there's many people listening that have experienced that, where they've physically gone and jerked themselves, and without doing anything significant, have ended up injuring themselves. So that's really what you can, that sort of smoother movement reduces the likelihood of that kind of injury.
Carry the load at waist height, and again, keeping the load close to the trunk to observe the rules of force. It's always good throughout the lift as well to keep the eyes focused on something which is directly in front of the task being completed. What this will ensure is that the whole spine stays in line, so we're not moving the neck to the left or the right, we're not turning to see anything what's going on around us, we're actually focused on lifting this particular load safely. And then equally, if possible, set down at waist height. So we're not just lifting from the floor and lowering to the floor, we're lifting from an area which is safer than lifting from floor to knee or knee to hip or hip to chest or chest to above head. We're doing something which is effectively going to keep us as safe ergonomically as possible.
And that piece of kit I mentioned earlier, essentially that's what it was doing. It was lifting all of these boxes. So rather than a person stretching at height, and as the load went down, then stooping over, it was constantly keeping the load at waist height, making it easier for the individual. So we'll move on to looking at this in a little bit more detail. And the first one would be about planning and preparing.
So to plan and prepare, generally speaking, this can be done quite crassly, and it's not a question of employees walking around kicking boxes to see what is in the load, what sort of weight is estimated, where they've got to get it to and from. But there's nothing better than that sort of recognition in relation to what the load is, what weight it is, than actually sticking your foot in it, so to speak. So the plan and preparation would be, do I have to move the item at all? And this creates problems even in an office environment with reams of paper which arrive in a box carrying 5. Do I have to move them at all, or can I leave the box in the storeroom and just take it out piece by piece? Does the load have to be moved by hand, or have I got mechanical aids to assist me with that? If there is any available equipment, how readily available is the equipment?
And I think the key with all of this is the load that you're asking people to lift within their capabilities.
So the principles then, again, just to emphasize, the dynamic stable base is exactly what we suggested earlier on. The object which is to be lifted, close in principle to the core, so it comes through the trunk of the body, feet shoulders width apart, and one in front of the other. Now, without turning into or this being considered to be sexist, generally speaking, women are particularly good at sustaining soft hips and knees throughout the duration of a lift. This could be for a number of reasons, but in principle, they are. Use joints in mid-range, as we suggested earlier on. The stronger joints are the ones in the mid-range because they're supported by the larger muscle. The vertebrae are supported by muscle, but the muscle is very, very tiny. Keep the load close in proximity to the trunk. So if it's going from the floor to the waist, we've got a natural, no jerky movement to get it up to. And importantly, don't twist. Most damage is results from the fact that people actually twist during the operation of lifting something. So the dynamic stable base, as we suggested, and this is something that you could try at home and something our children are particularly good at. As children grow through being a toddler, they're really good at sustaining a stable base to pick things up. They're really good at having the flexion in the joints, especially the knees and the hips. And they're really good at using the strongest muscle in the body, which is that muscle what links the hip to the knee to actually complete the task with. This is the important thing is, please do get one in front of the other, because what that gives is the stability of front to back, as well as from left to right. So soft hips and knees, and in the picture demonstrating it, we can generally demonstrate this. For anybody who's watched the sport of golf, golfers are usually good before they actually tee off or drive the ball at maintaining soft hips and knees, because there's going to be an awful lot of effort just in swinging the club and an awful lot of impacts when releasing the club head into the golf ball. And what this stance does is it reduces the loading on the back. It increases that stability and balance, depending on what is in the load. So if the load is a stable load, i.e. solid matter, we've already got a great stance and stable left. The difficulty comes with the load. If the load is containing something which is maybe liquid in substance, then the movement of the load automatically moves the liquid, which creates instability. So keep joints in mid-range, and what this demonstrates is the back is always in its strongest position when it's in that natural sort of S shape. And please do keep that load as close as possible. Again, we're observing the rules of force. Keep the load as close to the trunk as you can. With regards to anything which is being done from the arms, it's important to keep the shoulders strong throughout this lift. It's also important to use muscles more efficiently, and what we mean by that is use the strongest muscles in the torso. And what this also does is stops the need for twisting. The further away the load, the less stable it becomes, the more the twist will be required. And the stance, as we mentioned earlier before, it's been wonderfully executed in the picture with regard to head over hips over knees, so that the stance there with having the load close in proximity enables the individual, and the feet at shoulders width apart, enables the individual to actually assess the load and to get the load up through the knees. Again, clothing is quite important in this. What we don't want to do is expose a female who's not wearing anything with regards to a trouser to something which could be considered to be indignified. So the stance, with this particular picture, what we're doing with this, it's often referred to as the proposal. Some people, because of capability, have difficulty getting down to actually assess the load, and they find it easier to go down on 1 foot. Hence the reason you can see from the picture why it's referred to oftenly as the proposal. And if it is presenting a ring, obviously there's not an awful lot of weight to be presented under that ring, but equally if it's lifting a box, if the load is transferred through what I'd call the non-standing leg, i.e. the leg which is vertical to the spine, the same principle applies with actually getting the load up to waist height.
And this is sort of stance you're seeing here would be sort of ideal for low-level work. For example, if there's a box on a low-level shelf or racking, so a good example where that could be used.
Items height. So this creates an awful lot of difficulty, an awful lot of injuries sustained in the workplace when lifting something from above head height. And generally speaking, the principle's pretty similar. It's 1 foot behind the other one, and it's of the leading foot, it's ball of foot, and of the rear foot, it's heel of foot. And generally speaking, it's a rocking movement, again with soft mid joints, hips and knees, to enable you to find out whether that can be lifted down correctly or not.
What we would say is often when we do visits to premises, you quite often see inappropriate storage of goods, so very heavy items on high level. Now, a couple of things. A, that can make it unstable from a general safety point of view, but from the point of view of manual handling, how do we get that load down? And we ask that question, then it's quite often with difficulty. So again, just consideration of if you've got boxes or equipment to store, put the heavier items a bit lower down and the lighter ones a little bit higher up. May sound like common sense, but it is something we come across quite often.
Now on this particular slide you'll see some good and some bad. So what we've got is the golf ball pickup via the bends, via the crouch, And obviously the smiley face has been put on the last picture because we often do that. Often a good demonstration with staff would be to actually use, this is the bad mechanism, the golf ball pickup, and the good would be the crouch. And when you do this with staff, sometimes you'll hear some cracks and creaks of bones in the knees, and what that demonstrates is under usage. So it also identifies that people generally don't do it that way, unless there's a medical condition with the knees. But often, if people do use that and there's no evidence of any sort of creaking or cracking, it demonstrates that there is a lubrication sort of thing due to practice or common practice.
If we go from left to right, we go essentially from instability to bad posture through to what you would class as the correct method of pickup, which is much more stable.
So a good posture with regards to supporting, there are certain things what we will lift, and we will lift where they're not near an edge of a particular areas. A lot depends on how we're going to get that thing to an area which is close to our trunk. So with regards to the picture on the left, we've got a picture on the left which is a stiff picture. There's no flexion, there's no mid-joint range to being flexed, there's no support, there's no, almost like a shock absorber effect. But on the right-hand side, with again the picture of the smiley face, well, there's one front foot in front of the other. There's stability, there's balance, there's joints being used in mid-range, and the individual will slide it quite safely to the end of the platform to enable her to lift it off. The up and over lift. As you can see from the pictures, we've got something which is a load which has been taken to the edge of the support, and what's happening with this is we're transferring weight onto a shoulder using the power of the legs. And if you look at the stability within the second picture in particular, the individual is using the power of the legs as the drive to actually get hold of the load and support it through the shoulder. And then naturally the right leg is coming in line with the left leg to enable the individual to walk or maneuver the load in a safe manner. The up and over, now we're getting into a stage where we're using mechanical aids, and the mechanical aids being used in this particular case is something which requires a little bit of pushing or a little bit of pulling. When pushing is easier, it's easy to have the hands over the bar. And when pulling is easier, it's easy to have the hands under the bar. It's not uncommon though for people to use one over and one under. That's when the bar would be often at mid-range. With this particular slide, we've got a little bit of an overlap with working at height regulations because that's effectively what we're doing. We're now ascending or descending stairways. And what the right-hand photo allows you to do is to see where you're going. It's not uncommon for somebody to be handling a box when going upstairs because there's a lack of a lift or a lack of mechanical aids, and they'll do it front on as the first picture demonstrates. Well, I'm sure we've been in a position at home where we've been carrying something down the stairs and not been able to see the platforms where we're putting our feet. This also enables us to increase stability where we're carrying such as stuff, and it increases support. What it does make it difficult to do, and always consider when ascending or descending a stairway, whether the lift can be sustained whilst maintaining 3 points of contact, hence the reason for the handrail.
So this brings us to the end of our very short introduction and awareness of manual handling. Now, what we would say, generally speaking, is that you know, the reason for mentioning some of the injuries from manual handling early on is because it can have a significant impact on an organisation. If you have someone that's doing manual handling activities and they get injured and they're off, then clearly that's not good for them, and it's not good for your business either. So we would certainly encourage some manual handling training, but also from the point of view of protecting the business in the event of someone being injured and issuing a civil claim for their injury because they want some compensation. So again, what you're looking to have in place is sort of risk assessments, etc., and demonstration that you've done some basic manual handling training. So just a quick summary. We know it can cause injuries because it's a big cause of injuries across the UK and also Ireland. What we'd be saying is, can you avoid doing manual handling in the first place? That's part of the risk assessment process. Is there an alternative way of doing it? If you do have to do manual handling, make sure it's planned and prepared. You know what the route is, you know what the load is, etc., etc. And of course, what we're trying to encourage is adopting simple techniques, what we've covered today, to reduce the risk of injury. Now, of course, you're not going to be expert in manual handling as a result of a half-an-hour webinar. However, what we would say is that should you require additional training, please get in touch and we can support you with that. If you've not done any sort of assessment of risk, we certainly encourage you to do that. If you have the health and safety service with us, within the Business Safe online service, there's sample assessments there as well. But if you need any assistance or support, please get in touch with us through our advice line, or alternatively, you can send an email to andrew.rivet@peninsula-uk.com. So all it remains for me to say is thank you for joining us. I hope you got something out of it, and we'll send the slides out in the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much.